So good morning everybody. I'm Mark Tufnell. I'm Deputy President of the CLA, that's the Country Land and Business Association, and I'm lucky enough to have here with me this morning Chris Pincher, who's MP for Tamworth, and he's also the Minister for Housing. And as part of our Rural Powerhouse Week on Planning, we wanted to look at future opportunities and also future government policy. So Chris, thank you very much indeed for coming. The CLA, just to give you a bit of background, has just under 30,000 members. We've got about 250 different types of business that are operating in that rural space. And quite often, many of our members come up against planning as something that stops them help diversify their business. We provide a lot of advice to our members, and planning questions come right at the top of our agenda. So to see the new white paper that the government has brought out, that I know the consultation period will just have closed, Planning for the Future, I wonder if you could be kind and just explain what you hope it will achieve and how you think it's going to be able to benefit specifically rural businesses and communities.
Well, thanks first of all, Mark, for inviting me here this morning. It's great to join you. In fact, the first job I applied to, well, one of many anyway, was to the CLA. Unfortunately, that was a long time ago and you didn't give me a job, but I've moved on since then, and I hope that I'm now doing a job that can be of interest and benefit to your members and supporters and friends. The planning white paper is designed to consult with a broad range of communities to see how we can make better our planning system, which essentially is a 73-year-old rather opaque construct, as anybody that's tried to get into it will know, to make it much more transparent so people understand it and can engage with it, to make it much more quick and easy to navigate so decisions can be made much more effectively for all players involved. And if those players are your members, people involved with the Country Landowners Association or involved with rural businesses, then I think that the speed that we want the new system to operate at, with the transparency that we want from it, will mean that smaller businesses, and oftentimes rural businesses are smaller and diversified businesses, will be able to navigate more quickly through the system. It should therefore be more effective for them to use, and the results should be much more clear from the get-go, and that should reduce costs.
Well, that's encouraging. We might pick up on speed a little bit later. Now, the paper focuses on, it's got three pillars. You have Pillar 1, Planning for Development, Pillar 2, Planning for Beautiful and Sustainable Places, and Pillar 3, Planning for Infrastructure and Connected Places. Now, within Pillar 1, I'd specifically like to focus on the three types that you've suggested that planning should be focused on. Growth areas, which you say should be suitable for substantial development, renewal areas suitable for development, and then protected areas. So what will that practically mean for rural areas and open countryside?
Well, what it means first of all is that local communities, local planning authorities will need to decide for themselves where they want their geography to fall into, which of the categories of zones they want their land to fall into. What will be their development zone, what will be their renewal zone, and what will be their protected zone. And it's for local authorities to decide that, local communities to decide that. So if you want to protect your farmland, for example, it would be possible to put your land into Zone C, the protected zone. Equally, you'll be able to protect important green spaces and the green belt or sites of outstanding natural beauty. Those areas that you want to develop you can designate them. You can then say up front what the rules are about building in those, so that our controls and the local community can get involved, say what it thinks about what it wants that design to look like, the size of it, the placing of it, the infrastructure around it, and make planning decisions up front and strategically that way. In the renewal area, that would tend to be in the more urban spaces, perhaps in town centres, where you have to reimagine the way land is used, and there you'll have a mixture of the present planning system and permitted development rights, depending on what it is the developer is proposing to develop. So it means that local communities will be able to protect areas that they think are important to them, but also make it easier to develop in those places that they want to see developed, but they'll have control over the look and the feel and the sustainability of those areas.
From that, this concept of a protected area, I think it's an area that many of our members will feel concerned about, because many of the members will be in what the majority in the local area might consider to be a protected area.
Yeah.
And the nervousness would be that they're not able then to develop any of their buildings and change anything that they have to create an additional business alongside their existing, say, farm. Is it your intention that that's where there would be a specific planning application that would carry on in the same way that it does at the moment, so that you wouldn't be frozen in aspic? Because freezing in aspic is not something we want to see that happen to the countryside. The countryside, I think, should develop and breathe.
Sure, let's be really clear. We're not trying to set the countryside or anywhere else for that matter, except for a few very clear circumstances, of course.
Yes.
In aspic, the countryside is a living, developing, breathing space, if you will, and we certainly want to make sure that businesses are able to develop. And I'm very interested, for example, looking at proposals for how we can more effectively use farmyards, often not seen from the road, often used by farmers in a more diverse way than perhaps they were 20 or 30 years ago. I'm keen to find out what more we can use those sorts of spaces for. So we're not trying to say that rural areas are entirely set in aspic and can't have work done on them, have development done on them, but that will have to be done in a much more controlled way. And of course it will depend very much on what countryside we're talking about, whether it's a national park, an area of outstanding natural beauty, a more normal, shall we say, rural area. I think in those sorts of places, then it will be certainly possible to bring forward applications in a traditional way to make sensible changes, and they have to be considered by the local community in that way.
So you talked earlier about speed, and there's quite a bit in the planning white paper about digital applications and speeding up the whole process, having a very much faster local plan. And I think at the moment only about half of local authorities actually have a local plan, and you're going to say that each local authority should have one, and it should be produced in a period of months, not years. One thing that our members find is that there's a huge amount of cost involved in these planning applications. There's a lot of upfront cost that has to be undertaken, and they get to the end of it and discover that planning permission has been refused for some apparent reason. We had a member with a AD plant, spent hundreds of thousands of pounds trying to help put energy back into the grid. It was refused. And it took a very long time. Do you feel that the planning white paper is going to help our members along those lines?
I think it will, because we want to set out very clearly what is developable quickly, and those areas that are protected from development, and those areas where you will need to go through a more normal and traditional planning process. So we do want speed to be an important component of this, and one of the ways of doing that, of course, is by digitalising planning, making the system of what is available for development and where available at your finger ends for information, rather than having to trawl through a lot of online data. So if we can digitalise the system, it'll be much more accessible and speedy. And if the rules about what can be developed are there up front, it means that a lot of the planning paraphernalia that applicants have to go through and communities have to go through will be reduced, which will mean that the entire process can be done much more quickly. Right now, a local plan can take up to 7 years to develop, and you're right, there are a number of local planning authorities that haven't got plans at all and haven't had them for very many years. Applications to those plans can take up to 5 years. So you can have somebody who's in secondary school now who wasn't even alive when the local plan process started to get that spade in the ground. We want to speed that up. These proposals will do that, and that will give the entire community greater clarity and I think reduce cost.
Do you think with the clarity that you want to bring, that it's going to be possible to do that where you have overlapping authorities? Well, not quite. What I mean is you have areas of land where you have planning authorities on the border, and then you have an overall unitary council. Unitary councils, county councils are not involved in planning unless they're unitary. District councils and borough councils are. You come to an area, for example, like this, where I'm in Lichfield District Council, I've come through Tamworth Borough Council, and there may be differences of opinion in one area to the other area. Do you think that that's going to make life very difficult for the planning authorities on the ground and the local communities?
Well, it's important that local authorities work together for the greater good of their wider community. We introduced a few years ago the duty to cooperate for councils. We're consulting as to whether that should continue. It doesn't work as effectively as we would like it, but we certainly need to find a mechanism by which local authorities combine to work together to make sure that regionally the right sorts of outcomes in terms of significant infrastructure or housing is provided. So I think, yes, we recognise that there is a challenge. There is a challenge with the planning system. There is, of course, the historic backdrop of England, the way our historic counties and the way our historic districts and boroughs over years have developed. And we've got to make sure that the system that we develop goes with the grain of our history and our geography, but also which is fit for modern purposes. So we're looking to consult on the white paper for planning, get as many inputs and submissions as possible so we get it right, but certainly how we encourage councils to cooperate is going to be an important consideration when we come to bring forward our final proposals.
Yeah, because I suppose from an overall house building point of view, where you've come up with an overall target of 300,000 houses a year, that's a national aspirational target. That has to be somehow spread down to the local authorities and picked up and matched by them. So in a funny way, you have although you're trying to make it local, you have a sort of top-down figure that you need to work to. Do you feel that there could be a case in certain protected areas, because they're by their very nature in open countryside or in rural areas, that you could actually begin to see some infill in certain villages, which would help with sustainability,
Mm-hmm.
and we've had a report out on sustainable villages.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you added, say, 3 or 4 more houses to a village, then actually you could go quite a long way
Mm-hmm.
towards meeting your overall target, rather than having these very, very big developments that appear on the outskirts of
Yeah.
much larger conurbations.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, the 300,000 new homes a year by the middle of the decade is an important target for us, because if you look at organisations as wide-ranging as KPMG, the accountancy firm, and Shelter, they say that we need to build many, many more homes, and there are a number of reasons for that. Affordability is a crucial concern. The fact that in too many parts of our country, house prices are beyond the means of people, particularly younger people who may want and need to live in the communities in which they grow up. There's also the challenge of the quality of stock. The handle for that often used is levelling up. There are parts of the country where the quality of stock really isn't what it needs to be. We want to make sure that as we calculate local housing need, we take into consideration stock quality as well. We also want to remediate brownfield land to make sure that we don't have to look to virgin soil, so to speak, all the time to build new homes. We need to reimagine our town centres. But also crucially, and this was what you were getting at in the nub of your question, is we've got to make our rural communities more sustainable. And I think your paper suggested that there are about 2,000 villages in the country where the services in them are just not sustainable because of the size of them. Now, I think that if we are able to make smaller changes, smaller additions to those sorts of communities, it can only be to their benefit. The way to do that is to make sure that we are encouraging small and medium-sized enterprises to build, because they're the builders that want to build on the smaller parcels of land rather than the bigger development sites. They tend also to be able to build more quickly, to different designs, to different tenures, which often lends itself more effectively to smaller rural communities. So you maintain that important sense of place. So I think the reforms that we're proposing, the digitalization element that I talked about earlier on, the clarity of the system, will aid SMEs. That ought to help them to find simple, sensible parcels of land in villages and around villages which are good for development, which can add to the infrastructure of those important parts of our community.
Because, I mean, that's very interesting, because one of those aspects within the definition of sustainability that for some reason is often missed out by a council is this issue of digitalisation and IT infrastructure and broadband connectivity. And it's something that we've been pushing for as an organisation for a long time. But it's not regarded as one of the features within sustainability. So they might look and say, well, has it got a pub? Is there a local bus service? Well, actually, as we've discovered in this latest lockdown we've had with COVID, a lot of people have been able to work happily from home because they have the broadband connection. And so you could easily argue that they make themselves a much more sustainable community, whereas technically, from a planning point of view, they're not. So I think that that's an aspect that we as an organisation would like to see very much picked up. And if it could come through in the consultation and in the white paper and be part of an NPPF and how that relates through, I think that would be really important.
Well, I'll take it, Mark, as though I've just been lobbied. But I mean, in all seriousness, make sure that you and your members feedback to the consultation and make the points about sustainability in that pillar of our proposals. I certainly know from my own experience, just up the road from where we are now in a village called Eddingale, for a long time the villagers there have campaigned to keep their red telephone box, and the reason for that is because the broadband connectivity is not great, and because the phone signal just isn't there. And so if you have an emergency, in fact, you need the local telephone box in order to make a call. So I certainly recognise the importance of rolling out digital connectivity to our rural communities. As a local MP, I'm campaigning for it all the time, and I'll certainly take back that message to my colleagues in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And I know when Nicky Morgan was Secretary of State, she announced a very big programme of digital investment. I'm sure that our determination to connect up everybody under Oliver Dowden will only continue to grow.
No, well, that's very encouraging. Thank you. I just wanted to ask about a specific element within the private rented sector that has just recently come up that certainly a lot of our members are worried about. And it's the intended removal of Section 21 notice to ask a tenant to vacate and leave their property. And there obviously has to be grounds for it. And there's a 2-month notice period. And the proposal is that that's taken away and you have to do it through a Section 8 and you have to take it through the court system. Now our concern is that the court system is very overloaded and that could take a very long time. And we're particularly concerned where our members may have members of staff who would like to go and occupy that house to help them with a diversification within an existing business or whether they need it for their current business that's running. And we're very nervous that by taking that away, actually you're going to discourage people from investing in the private rented sector, which is an important part of the economy and I think so often gets overlooked. And I don't know, Minister, whether you could update us on where we are with the thoughts on Section 21.
Well, we made a manifesto commitment at the general election last year that we would remove Section 21 of the 1988 Housing Act, which, as you say, allows a landlord to seek possession of their property without giving any reason to the tenant. Now, in removing that in the Renters Reform Bill that we will bring forward when we've got a more stable social and economic terrain, once the emergency that we're presently going through is passed. In that bill, we'll want to make sure that we look again to make sure that landlords do have rights to repossess their properties. You mentioned Section 8, for example, so if a landlord wants to sell their property or move it into it themselves, we want to make sure that that right is much more clearly defined, and we want to make sure that landlords' broader rights as well as responsibilities are more clearly defined. That bill is not in the immediate offing in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. You'll appreciate that there is a lot going on at the moment, and I don't want to bring forward what is important legislation, which we have to think about thoroughly, which we have to get right. I don't want to bring that forward at a time when there are lots of other distractions, both economic and social. So we will reform Section 21, but we'll also make sure that the new Renters Reform Act, in protecting the rights of renters, also recognises and refines the rights of landlords, because we want to make sure that the private rented sector, which is the second biggest provider of homes after private purchase, about 21% of the housing stock is available for private rent. We want to make sure that is a successful, modern and viable business, so it's able to service the owners but also provide a good service to the tenants too.
No, well, thank you for that. And then just a couple of more questions, if I may. Do you think that enough people from rural areas are going to have accessibility to live in the areas that they grew up in?
It is a challenge. It has been a challenge. I really hope that as a result, and I also believe as a result of the reforms that we're proposing, then it will be easier to build sensibly in rural and semi-rural areas, so that people do have the homes that they want and need. I stress, though, it's important that local people, local planning authorities, make those decisions about where and what that building looks like. And it's really important that we stress that in these reforms we're also keen to make sure that we build beautifully as well as sustainably. So local authorities will have access to design codes, and they can choose what they want new buildings to look like and what they want the new places that they're designing to look like. So you really do have control about what is developed. But we want to make sure that there is development in those places where housing is needed, particularly for local people. And I know, again, from my own experience as the local Member of Parliament, in places like Weeford, places like Hints, there is a dearth of available property to buy, and it's challenging to build there for all sorts of reasons, and that presents a real challenge for local people wishing to stay local. So that's one of the things which is at the forefront of my mind, and I'm sure that as our proposals for consultation morph their way into proposals for legislation, then we'll have considered that and make sure that it's in the propositions.
Thank you. We've spent a lot of time on Pillar 1. You've touched on Pillar 2 and planning for beautiful and sustainable places. And beauty, there was a great commission that the late Sir Roger Scruton produced, and that I'm sure has fed through into this report. And then Pillar 3 is looking at infrastructure and connected places. But just to bring it all together, what do you think you'd like to achieve for rural areas? And I stress rural areas because that's where our members are based in your time as Minister for Housing.
I hope that as a result of the reforms that we're bringing forward, and I look forward to introducing them and seeing them through, then we will have a much more diversified economy in rural communities. We will have, as a result of that diversification, a much richer economy for all the people that are engaged in it. And as a result, we'll have an opportunity for people to run the businesses or be part of the businesses that they really want to be, that they'll be able to live in homes which are beautifully built, which are fantastically designed, which are environmentally friendly for the future. And we'll be able to look back and say, we may have had a lot of questions to ask about those reforms, but my goodness, thank goodness that we asked them. Thank goodness that we got the answers. Thank goodness that we implemented those reforms, because they've given us fantastic communities which can live and exist into the second half of this century and beyond it.
Well, Chris Pincher, Minister for Housing, thank you very, very much indeed for your time this morning.
It's been great to talk to you, Mark. I hope that you all have a successful end to the year, and let's look forward to 2021 being a much better one for us all than 2020 has been.
Thank you very much.